In the last section, we finally got some content to show up on our page. In this section, we're going to take another look at our mock-up for the application that we're going to build and discuss how we're going to structure our structure our application with different components. So remember, a React application is made up of many different components. A component is a function or an object that returns some amount of HTML. So it makes sense that we can have different components for different functions or different purposes within our application. For example, we might have a single component that represents the search bar at the top, or a single component that represents the video title and video description panel down here. Looking at our mockup again, we definitely need a decent amount of HTML to achieve what we see here. Imagine for a second that if we stuck all the logic and all the markup required to make this entire application inside of our index.js file, all inside of our current app component that's being rendered to the page. It would get really messy really fast. React knows how to render multiple components on the screen at one time, like many components at the same time, and it does it really, really fast. So in a traditional React application, rather than stuffing all of our logic and all of our JSX that produces HTML into a single component, we spread it out into different components. So we have different components with different purposes in our app. So looking at our mock here, we're going to decide on how to divide out our application into separate components. So there's really no science in deciding how to break up your application into separate components. Knowing the best way to do it is something that really just comes with practice. So as we go through this exercise, this is kind of a somewhat arbitrary, decision on how we're going to break stuff up here. But let's go ahead and give it a shot anyways and see how it turns out. So I have these red boxes off here to the left-hand side. We're going to box each area of the application that's going to be represented with a separate component. So, for example, I'm going to say that the search bar at the top should probably be its own component. So this is one component right here. We will have one file in our application, and it will be responsible for rendering an input that will function as the search bar. Okay, so that's one component right there. We'll probably do another component for the video player and the title and description. So this is another component. We'll make another one that represents a single video preview over here on the right. And so if you think about this, we'll have many of these components right here, right? This kind of video detail will have however many previews on the screen at the same time. So we can always have multiple of one component on the screen, totally fine. Finally, we'll probably have one more component that will render a list of those video details. So we can always nest components inside of each other, and one very common purpose for nesting is to render a list of components. So we're basically have one component that shows a list of components. Okay. Finally, we'll have one big overall component, which is going to be our app or index.js, and that's going to contain all of these components. So a lot of stuff on the screen right here. Please don't be overwhelmed with this, all the line work that's going on here. Basically, the only thing I want to convey to you here is that we're going to break our app up into separate components, each that isolate as much functionality as possible. Building small components like this makes it really easy to reuse our code throughout our application. So for example, if we had some other area of our application that needed a search bar like this, we could very easily reuse this component over there as well. So we'll have five component types total. 4 to do the overall application, and then one that contains them all. Remember, index is the root of our application. All of the other components will branch from inside of it. So let's flip back over to our code editor. Now here's the rule. We always make one component per file. Always one. No matter how small it is, no matter what, always one component per file. So if you've never worked on a JavaScript framework before like this that likes to isolate code, so like say Angular or Backbone, It's going to get a little bit overwhelming at first with all these different, tiny files floating around, but trust me, you will get used to it in due time. So here's what we're going to do. Inside of our source folder over here, we're going to make a new folder called components. And then we're going to just stub out for right now a separate file for each of the components we're going to make. So I'm going to make a new file, and the first one will be searchbar.js, and then we'll have videodetail.js. Video detail will be containing the video player and the title and description below it. We'll do videolist.js and videolist.item.js. So these second two, video list item and video list, as you might imagine, represent the list of video previews over here on the right. Okay, so this looks like a pretty good file or project structure. The file names are pretty clear on which components are going to live in which one. If the idea of components and having all these different components floating around is still confusing, don't sweat it at all. As we start to flesh out this application, it'll start to get a lot more clear what all these separate files are doing here. So let's go ahead and continue inside of the next section.